slight change of plans. I realized that I have some loose ends, some things to show you before the film, and a slightly longer introduction to the film today. So the other activity on the final project involving hands-on research of short stories will be done on Tuesday. On Tuesday, I can devote most of the class to that. I just need to add a few things about Barzini, so it'll work much better. We'll have more time. So what I'm going to do now, before today's film, I'll show you first 2 short videos about the Itala car that drove from Beijing to Paris to give you a sense of what this vehicle was. Then, as promised, I'll show you 1 short scene from the conclusion of Trafic that we watched last week and the actual conclusion for a total of about 5 minutes, perhaps. I'll introduce today's film, Le Mans, and then we'll watch the initial sequence of Le Mans to be continued on Thursday of next week. So, of course, keep in mind that under week 11, there is a link to a page devoted to the film Le Mans that we'll watch today, but I'll move this out of the way right now. So the first video, maybe you can draw the curtains down so that we have next one as well. This video was produced by the museum in Turin called Museo dell'Automobile, which is the largest automobile museum and the oldest in Italy, established by Carlo Ruffia, who was involved, for example, also at the beginning of the 20th century with the creation of the Italian Automobile Club, the equivalent of AAA for Italy, and one of the largest such museum in Europe, because even if you consider the fact that the Mercedes-Benz Museum in Stuttgart has practically as many vehicles as the one in Turin, the museum in Stuttgart has a lot of replicas, whereas the one in Turin mostly has original cars. Some of their cars are kept in working conditions, and that is the case of the Itala, at least after the final restoration a few years back. And the video shows you, the video commentary is in Italian, if I'm not mistaken, but we're interested in seeing the car, how it drives around, have a sense of the size of this substantial vehicle that was able to go through almost non-existent roads for roughly 10,000 miles. It's just made with a better camera than mine. Okay. And in 1907, a group of mechanics, adventurous travelers, and a crew with cameras went over the full itinerary with a faithful replica of the 1907 Itala, and they made a documentary series shown on Italian TV out of it. So this is a portion of one of the episodes. And they actually tried to navigate more or less the same itinerary, but because of international politics, they couldn't follow exactly the same itinerary. Now we go back to Trafic. If you remember, or if you weren't here last week, the thin storyline is one where a recreational vehicle made by a fictional company has to be transported all the way from Paris to Amsterdam to be shown at a car show, hoping that there will be orders by customers to support the survival of the company. The vehicle is placed, this new vehicle is placed on an older track that has a lot of breakdowns and other issues. So a trip that should last a little more than half a day becomes an affair, an ordeal. In here, the vehicle that you see parked inside the garage with its camping tent out in orange, with orange fabric, is being repaired again. And the characters will spend the time here. And during this time, remember how at several points in the film, we see frames of the moon landing of 1961 with the Apollo 11 rocket and the astronauts. At several points, the characters watch TV to see initially the departure of the rocket from planet Earth, then the astronauts walking on the moon, and in the typical paradoxical fashion of this film, we'll see the characters watching TV and trying to reproduce in a theatrical, choreographed performance the unsteady movements of the astronauts on the surface of the moon. And at the same time, the hyper-modernity of the moon landing is contrasted with this very place somewhere in Holland. That is to say, a marginal place near a canal with fogs, with boats coming through the canal, with people living in boat houses, something that seems to be absolutely anti-modern. It's a very short sequence, 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll watch the conclusion. So another film from 1971, as Trafic was, and as I said, the production of this film was prolonged and very involved, with the use of plenty of original sports car from that era, being driven at speeds that at this point and for the last 20 years, companies insuring film productions have not allowed, right? Because in order to cover the liabilities of the actors involved, insurance companies would not allow them to drive at the speeds that Steve McQueen and the other actors were driving during the shooting of the film. The production of the film, the shooting of the film itself, has become legendary, so much that in 2015, a documentary was made by the son of Steve McQueen, Chad, who was there as a kid because Steve brought his family. They rented a posh house in the countryside at less than an hour from the racetrack, and there his wife and his 2 kids at that time were living, and he was going back and forward. But sometimes Chad would visit the set, the racetrack, and there are pictures and of him sitting in one of these cars with his father, and in the documentary, he has stories. In the documentary, he goes out to interview some of the people involved in the shooting of the film, and also he found some discarded film that was not edited into the final cut of the movie. So it's an interesting documentary. This is Chad. He actually died last year, in September of last year, at age 64. And this is him as a kid with his father right, dressed as Michael Delaney, the character he played in the film. And to confirm the lore surrounding the production of the film, at least two long books have come out, one in 1999, the other in 2017, about the shooting of the film, with plenty of pictures and stories. You have to keep in mind that the film itself was not a huge success when it came out in the theaters, but it was a slow-burning kind of film that gained popularity within a niche group of automobile aficionados, so much so that until maybe 10 years ago, you wouldn't be able to find it on any streaming platform. It was only sold on DVD, and the sales of those DVDs were steady. Besides the books about the production of the film, the documentary, a graphic novel was also published in 2017. I have a copy of that, and they were supposed to finish the story. The first book, the first volume, was not the complete story, but they never found the funds to continue. But these are some of the strips in this graphic novel. This is the first page, and as you will see today, the sequence, the story in the graphic novel follows the movie exactly, sometimes reproducing some of the frames. However, interestingly, the graphic novel has more lines than the film itself, which has the style almost a documentary, showing you things as they happen, letting you guess what is going on. And in fact, in the film, we'll see Steve McQueen coming to the racetrack the day of the race with his Porsche, stopping in the same place where the previous year he had an accident that almost killed him and injured mortally the driver of a Ferrari, Piero Belgetti, and he still feels the trauma and the guilt from having been involved in an accident where the other driver died. And in the film, you just see him stopping by, looking at the guardrail. We notice that the guardrail has a section that is completely new because it was replaced after the original section was bent in the accident followed by a fire. And you just see him immersing in his reverie, in his memory of the accident. No lines there, whereas in here you have a French policeman stopping by to explain what happened. A huge crash happened here during last year's Le Mans. One of the drivers died, the other must be in a wheelchair now, right? The graphic novel felt the need to restore some of the narrative to make it clear enough, whereas the movie lets you guess everything or almost everything. And this is very similar to another sequence that we'll see in the film, with the cars being downloaded from the tracks that took them to the racetrack, right? Attenzione, non fatela cadere. Of course, I bought the Italian version of this. So they're saying, careful, don't let it drop. The mechanics are unloading the cars. And before we talk about the movie, we have to talk about the interest that Steve McQueen took in racing, because he had a personal interest in racing that motivated him to produce, with his own production company, a film that would encapsulate the essence of racing, driving at high speed. And following his passion, and also in preparation for this film, he bought an expensive, very advanced, very quick race car from Porsche, and drove that car at a number of races in preparation for the scenes where you would have to play the part of Michael Delaney, this Porsche team pilot. So, for example, in 1969, just out of his own interest, he participated in this famous car, Baja 1000, with a specially made car called the Baja Boot. And later on, he raced a car that he had purchased from Germany. He entered that car in the 24 Hours of Le Mans as a guest car, not as a racing car. They drove for about 8 or 10 of the 24 hours. And in order to shoot the film, he prepared an encampment for all the staff and the actors called the Solar Village near the racetrack. And Solar was the name of his production company. He spent considerable amount of time finding the actual cars. Porsche, as the official company, granted use of their cars, even the official cars, whereas Ferrari, who to this day are very reluctant to participate in such projects, refused, but they found private team Ferrari cars and used them. And they used a lot of drivers, even top drivers. For example, Joe Seifert appeared in some of the scenes, and he was a full-time Formula One driver, one of the top drivers at that time, who later on died in a horrible crash. During that time, a lot of Formula One drivers and drivers from other kinds of categories in the sport of racing ended their life that way. This is the original restored Baja Boot of Steve McQueen, which was later purchased by a movie producer who lived in Connecticut, might still be there even if threatened to leave Connecticut for political reasons. And he was so obsessed by Steve McQueen and his vehicles that he made one. He has a small production, a small factory producing sports car, and he made this called the Boot, Glickenhaus Boot. And this is the brochure where they're trying to sell you this very expensive off-road vehicle and very powerful as well. These are documents from some of the races that Steve McQueen participated in 1970, in the months leading to the summer before the shooting of the film. This is the expensive, very quick race car he purchased from Germany. Of course, it looks like nothing, but the essence of this car is exactly that it weighs probably 500 or 600 kilos, right? So that would be like 1,200 pounds. The body is probably made of plexiglass, thick plastic, essentially. And the engine is placed as close as possible to the center of the vehicle. And the driver is sitting very low. So because the vehicle is so light, it is also very quick. Acceleration more than top speed would be the quality of such vehicle. Here we see a series of images, Steve McQueen racing in secondary or tertiary racetracks in California. And you can see how serious these racetracks are, right? There are plants coming through the asphalt or the cement of the track. And can you imagine Steve McQueen showing up at a small track with this fancy European car, competing with and beating a lot of people with older Ferraris, Jaguars, other British cars like MGs. Of course, they couldn't compete with him. His car was faster by a lot, right? But he enjoyed that. Of course, he basked in the success. He had a big ego and also gained familiarity with the kind of racing that would be represented in the film. Here we see in Phoenix in 1970, and his car is this one. And some of these cars are older cars at this point. For example, this, or the one in the back. And probably some of these cars, besides being 4 or 5 years older were not as well maintained. Their engines had not changed all the parts that would allow their engines to be pushed to the limit. And Steve McQueen, who enjoyed anything with the thrill and not minding the stakes involved in the movie he would have to play a part in the summer, a movie with a budget of $7.5 million, which was huge at that time, even participated in a motocross race just for his own pleasure, and of course he broke a foot. And then when he went to Sebring, that was a scheduled race, the last before he moved to France, to participate in this prestigious race with some of the same vehicles that you will see, the same kind of Ferraris and Porsches you will see in the film, he showed up with a broken foot. He showed up with his Porsche, and in spite of everything, right, these were the official cars of the official Ferrari and Porsche teams in the championship, participating in the championship. In spite of the circumstances, Steve McQueen was about to win the race after 12 hours. And what happened there, which is documented in articles such as this one that is linked on the site, is the stuff of legends. Because Ferraris and Porsches had mechanical problems towards the end of the race, during the last hour, Steve McQueen was leading the race. And the PA system of the track announced that Steve McQueen was in the lead, and the crowd roared, right? Because they recognized the name of the actor. And Mario Andretti, who had just retired from the race, his own car had terminal mechanical problems, heard Steve McQueen's name, and he was about to leave the racetrack to go, because the next day he had another race somewhere else, and he wasn't happy with the race handling this way. So he went back to the team, and they allowed him into another car that was behind, several laps behind Steve McQueen's car. And Mario Andretti put in fast lap after fast lap, gaining time over the slower Porsche of Steve McQueen, who was also driving the company of another driver, Peter something, don't remember his last name now. And eventually, before the end of the race, Andretti passed Steve McQueen's car, won the race for Ferrari, but Steve McQueen still finished second in this prestigious international race with a broken foot. I met a driver who was there that day with a British MG at Lime Rock, Connecticut, just 3 or 4 years ago, and he told me, well, of course, Steve McQueen didn't drive much because of his broken foot. The other driver did most of the driving, and the other driver was more of a professional driver than Steve McQueen ever was. This is the same car you saw before. It has been repainted, different numbers, and modified to shoot film. So the camera, the car had three cameras. You can see here, this is the box covering one of the cameras, and this hump is because they were using actual film. And there were additional cameras underneath this dome, and this car was allowed to enter the race as a guest car, not driving for points, but they did, as I said, 10 hours more or less, and during those 10 hours they shot thousands of meters of film, more than they would ever need, because of course then if you want to use this film you have to review all of it, but they still use some of the original film that they shot at the actual race. So when we watch the sequence that later, you will see that some of the scenes are from the actual race taken from this car. There is a frame in the film where you see this car driving by. And this gives you a better sense of the place where the camera were mounted in front and in the back. And they have a professional driver going around, even in the rain, as it happened that year. We said the production cost was very high. However, Steve McQueen prolonged the shooting, never being satisfied with his scene, so long that by the end of the summer, the film was not done yet. In fact, they didn't have a complete script yet. They hadn't decided how to finish the story. And in order to save the project, Steve McQueen had to sell the rights to the film, surrender, he was the producer, he had to surrender his share in the film. As an actor, he had to give up on his pay, and I think it was promised something like $750,000, which was a big paycheck. So he never made a dime out of this film, but he wanted the film to be made. This Hollywood company called in a traditional director who finished the shooting, edited the film to make sense. But overall, the original inspiration of Steve McQueen remained in the film, which was, his inspiration was to show racing in as raw a form as possible. Whereas most films of later times, including, let's say, Formula One with Brad Pitt, in those films, the storylines of the characters overwhelm the racing scenes. He wanted to capture the essence of racing. And that's why you have long scenes without lines, just getting you immersed. It was also the style of the period, called the French New Wave, imitated by plenty of American directors. The idea being that a film has to be first and foremost a visual experience, and the spectators is not the recipient of the film. The spectator participates in the experience by trying to understand and guess what is going on, right? You're watching the film and you're trying to piece the film, the story, the characters together. That was supposed to be the experience at that time. Whereas movies of today are the opposite. They assume that at least part of the time you're watching your phone, and so they're explaining the story at various points. They're over-explaining, over-clarifying everything, right? Everything you see was done mechanically. There are no digital effects. They did have mechanisms to remote control the cars for the accidents. Of course, they couldn't crash the actual Porsches and Ferraris from the teams that they borrow them from. So they dressed up the less expensive Lola T70, which costs a tenth of the other cars, and they made it look like a Ferrari or a Porsche. And so in the production set, they referred to them as Lolari, if it was a Lola dressed up as a Ferrari, and Porschola, if it was a Lola dressed up as a Porsche. They were so serious in their shooting that one of the drivers, David Piper, who was still alive at the time of the documentary, lost a leg, had an accident, and one of his legs had to be amputated mid-thigh, and lived on a wheelchair the rest of his life. And yet, when he was interviewed by Chad McQueen, he did not blame his father. He understood what Steve McQueen wanted to do, that racing had to be shown as risky an enterprise as it is. Of course, as I said, this is way better than any of the recent movies, including Ferrari, which in some ways is terrible. The story between the characters is not bad. The racing is bad. And F1 is not bad as a film, but not a memorable racing film. Rush, among the latest batch of racing movies, is by far the best. But the race shots are good, but not realistic, because instead of using the actual cars from 1976, which are still available in the hands of collectors, they dressed up small Formula 2 and Formula 3 cars to look like Ferrari. And in the scenes, you can see the body of these cars shaken because they're screwed on different chassis. But the story in here is powerful. If you haven't seen Rush, I highly recommend it. And compared to Le Mans, as you will see, is a more traditional movie about the contrast between these two drivers, James Hunt, Niki Lauda, with very different racing styles and lifestyles. Okay? If anything, this film inspired Steve McQueen, who did better than it, Grand Prix 1966, directed by Frankenheimer, which included real shots of Formula One races with James Garner, an American actor of the period, Yves Montand, a French-Italian actor of that period. Okay, so I'll skip over some of the things that I can comment on during the film. What are the themes for this film? What is racing in the film? Racing is an existential condition, right? Existential meaning it's a matter of life and death. It fills one's life or it doesn't. It's not a professional career. Racing is not about winning. It's not about competing. Not even about being the fastest car. It's about being in the car, meaning being present in the car, mystically, right? Spiritually, moving at the highest possible speed. Then, even if you don't win, you've achieved this Zen status and you've made your life complete. Michaels is chasing this moment where nothing else matters, is completely present in the car, racing and doing nothing but racing at the highest possible speed, right? So it's not like the car is making him superhuman, like in some of the literature from the 1900s. And it's not like the car is alienating him, as in Trafic. Driving, as he will say in a very famous line, is the only moment he feels alive. And because of this, he has to give up other things in order to experience this moment. He has to get rid of his traumatic memories of the previous year's accident where this guy Belgetti died. He has to give up on the possibility of a romantic relationship with Lisa, the widow of Belgetti, who's come back to the same racetrack to get over her own past traumatic memories. And there is a tension between them. There is the possibility of a story, but whether or not this story will ever happen, the film doesn't even tell you. Probably not, but it's left to your interpretation based on the very last film, but on the very last scene, where they simply, the crowd, the race is over, the crowd has invaded the track, and they spot each other at a distance with people in the middle, and they look at each other, but it's hard to say whether that look is a goodbye or I'll see you, between Lisa and Steve McQueen playing the character of Michael Delaney. Okay? So, what is victory for Michael? Victory is getting past the memory of the accident from last year and his own guilt. Getting past the tension between him and Lisa. And Michael will have an accident during the race. The 24-hour race starts at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, goes on until the next day, and the dawn, at the end of the first night, he has a dramatic accident and he's about to give up. But the manager of the team gives him a ride in another car with a proviso that Michael has to ensure Porsche wins the race, which is something he will do. He will not come in first. But his victory is that he's done what he was called to do. He has restored a measure of justice to the team because he has crashed a second time. And I told you about his last salute with Lisa, right? Overall, they shot a lot of the film also around the spectators. It's the idea that not only for the drivers the film is important, the race is important rather, but also for the people, 300,000 people coming there to see the race. This is the modern temple, right? The racing becomes a modern temple for a large amount of people. Don't forget Steve McQueen's idea of what a hero must be in a movie, which worked to a degree, was popular during that time, feels a bit stale now. His idea of the hero as a cool guy was the traditional model of the silent hero who comes in, doesn't care about others, whether he's welcome or not, and leaves at the end without caring for a thank you, because his overall superior human quality doesn't need to be acknowledged by others, and he doesn't need to sport that superiority with others. That's why he underplays. He plays the character in an understated way, but that was his own idea of a cool hero, and he played that character in a number of films, especially Bullitt from 1968, which I highly recommend, and where, among other things, you find the most original car chase in films from that era, 10 minutes of just two cars going across the hills of San Francisco without any lines in that case either. Okay, this is Bullitt. And here we are. We have just a little bit of time to see the beginning of the film.